Congratulations on coming up with $4.8 billion in federal funding for infrastructure in Toronto. How are you going to fund?
Well,
hold it, let me ask the question.
Yeah.
How are we going to fund the city portion? Are we going to see tolls on the DVP and the Gardner? How are we going to come up with our portion?
Well, that's about a 9-part question. But having said that, let me address, first of all, don't congratulate me. I mean, I worked hard with the other mayors to put across, starting in the last election, and the reason I mention that is because we're going to do the same in the provincial election, but we went as a group of mayors to all 3 party leaders federally and said, we need you to step up on public transit and step up for real on a permanent, meaning a consistent basis going forward, so we understand what the commitment is so we can make our plans accordingly. And notwithstanding, there are people who I respect have views on different projects that we're going to fund. The fact is we now can fund a 15-year plan, and it is a plan, and it is real, and it's going to make a gigantic difference to the people in the City of Toronto. And I was listing them before, but I'll list them again. We've got Smart Track, we've got the Bloor-Danforth subway extension, we have the Scarborough East LRT, we have the waterfront transit, and we have the relief line, all of which are provided for, plus hundreds of millions of dollars we've already invested in expanded bus service and many other things to improve transit in the City of Toronto. And now with the federal commitment, 2 things have happened. Number one, they've already begun to fund. So for example, we've got several hundred new buses. You'll see them on the street. They're red, more red in color than the old ones. Those are half paid for by the federal government and half paid for by the city. But the only reason we were able to buy all those buses is because of the funding that came in phase 1 from the federal government. We now have phase 2, which is the $4.8 billion you referred to. The other bit of good news that we've lobbied heavily for is that the $4.8 billion comes with a requirement on the part of the federal government that the province match that at least to the extent of 33%. So in other words, they'll have to match, if the federal government represents 40, the province will have to come to the table with 33, or that money could fall off the table, which I don't think the province will allow to happen. And I'm happy about that. And I want to put it into context for a moment, because you sort of alluded to it, the dispute with the province. My dispute with the province, I think, will be resolved on the transit ultimately, in part because the federal government has said it has to be resolved in order to qualify for their money. So my bigger remaining disagreement with them comes on social housing. And I just happen to believe very strongly, especially in light of the decision that was taken about road tolls, which were disallowed, notwithstanding that I had positive encouragement publicly and privately to bring them forward, and had what I would describe as the courage to actually bring them forward to the City Council, which in turn had the courage to approve them by an overwhelming margin, that the province, especially in light of that decision, now has some obligation to step forward and help us with things like social housing. The toll money was to go to transportation, but if you think about it in the overall global sense, it would have freed up resources that we could have then applied to housing or applied to our share of transit. But this was disallowed, and some money was given through the fuel tax to make up for that, but not as much as would have been raised by the tolls. And so I'm going to continue to stand up for the people of Toronto with respect to the social housing. It is not acceptable to me that the bill of $1 billion plus to fix social housing for our most vulnerable residents should be paid for entirely by property taxes, which were not meant to pay for things like that, or paid for even through a combination of property taxes and the federal government alone helping us, because they're going to help with that too. On the question of road tolls, I'm assuming that's a dead issue for now because the Premier of the day has pronounced on it. But I will be going back to all 3 parties, as we did successfully prior to the federal election, and my fondest hope is that we will have all 3 parties agreeing as one, maybe in slightly different ways, to make firm commitments to the City of Toronto for funding on both transit and housing